To Ukraine now, where there are growing concerns that the fight back against Russia is stalling on the front lines. With the supply of Western weapons held up by political disputes, Ukrainian soldiers are increasingly relying on their own creations to defend against Russian forces. We'll have a special report on that in a moment, but first a look at why the high hopes for Ukraine's summer counteroffensive haven't been met.
Looking back, but also looking forward. In February, Ukraine's president marked a year since the start of Russia's invasion, remembering the fallen, rewarding those who made it, and raising hopes for the second year of the war.
We have survived. We have not been defeated, and we will do everything to win this year.
Zelensky promised to take the offensive in 2023. With his forces bolstered by deliveries of Western weapons and equipment, hopes were high for a decisive victory. In early June, after months of preparation, his troops launched their attack. They hit the Russians on 3 axes, 1 in the east, 2 in the south. The main objective was to cut the Russian army in 2 and sever its supply lines to Crimea. It was an ambitious plan. After months of intense and costly fighting, Ukraine succeeded in making some gains, but slowly and painfully. The battle for the southern village of Robotyne was symbolic of the difficulties. Ukrainian forces encountered well-prepared Russian defences, with dense minefields, mazes of trenches, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches.
The battles are fierce, but we are moving forward, and that's the main thing. I thank you guys for every Ukrainian flag that is now returning to its rightful place.
By the time the Ukrainian flag was raised over Robotyne at the end of August, Ukraine's army had suffered heavy losses. Zelensky said Ukraine had waited too long for Western weapons. The delay gave Russia more time to prepare the battlefield. As his forces took stock, Zelensky headed to Washington to bolster support for the war effort. After the setbacks, Republicans are reluctant to release more funds for Ukraine.
Ukrainians haven't given up and won't give up. We know what to do, and you can count on Ukraine, and we hope just as much to be able to count on you.
But Ukraine and the United States are at odds over what to do next. Kyiv wants to go back on the offensive. The US wants it to pursue a more conservative strategy. Russia, meanwhile, has regrouped and reinforced its troops. This footage claims to show a Ukrainian unit on the defensive near the eastern city of Avdiivka. Ukraine's counteroffensive failed to deliver. Only a new strategy and renewed international support can break what has now become a stalemate.
And our correspondent Nick Connolly is standing by in Kyiv for us. Nick, in February, President Zelensky said that 2023 would be the year in which Ukraine would win the war. What is he saying now?
I think, Gerhard, there's definitely a recognition here in Kiev that was a mistake to give these kinds of timelines. Now there's a real sense that the leadership on all levels is preparing to dig in for the long term. There are lots of things that were put off, like elections, like further mobilization. Those are now back on the agenda because they simply realize that they're going to need new troops next year and probably in the year after, and obviously operate in a much more difficult international situation where that help, if it does come, is coming in fewer but bigger tranches, so every hold-up is more significant than in the beginning phase of the war when you had a couple of €100 million every week or so, and one thing being held up was less of an issue. I think there is a kind of consensus, though, if you talk to people, that carrying on is the least bad option. Making peace now with Russia on Russia's terms. We've had Vladimir Putin basically making it clear that his war aims haven't changed, that he's expecting Ukrainian capitulation. That's not something that people you hear speak to want to really countenance.
Now, with international support seemingly waning and uncertain prospects, really, if we look into the next year, how is that affecting the morale of Ukrainian soldiers?
We were on the front lines just last week, and it is a very mixed picture. Obviously, you have more professional units, people who've been fighting sometimes since 2014 or earlier, who are used to spending winter in the trenches, who are used to dealing with the mice as well as the shell shock and the constant danger of Russian drones. Some units obviously are comprised of people who've been mobilized, who've been called up, and who don't want to be there or are really struggling to cope. But I think the most important thing is tiredness. The vast majority of the kind of frontline units have been fighting since the beginning of Russia's invasion, almost 2 years now, and they are just exhausted. Some of them might have had a 2-week holiday. Lots of them people will tell you that 2 weeks is not enough. You barely get used to being in a civilian environment and it's time to come home. And they are adamant that it's time to call up more people, younger people. So far, people under the age of 27 have been free of conscription, that they now need to be trained so that next year these units that have spent months and months at the front line will get time to regroup, retrain and prepare themselves for more years of war.
So what's the plan then for Ukraine's army? How is the country trying to become more successful militarily?
Well, there's also a lot of bitterness when you talk about this failed counteroffensive. Lots of people will tell you that they were just following basically recommendations given them by NATO advisors, by the Americans principally, who told them to get all their tanks, all their armoured vehicles in one place, put all their pressure on one location on the front lines, try to make a hole in those Russian defences, and that just proved impossible. The Russians had dug in, had created huge minefields. You just couldn't drive around them because they were hundreds of kilometres long, and they are now reverting to what they say is their tactic: lots of small attacks on foot, not in tanks that can be easily attacked by drones, trying to spread the Russians thinly, now attacking on the east bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson region, where the Russians didn't have a chance to dig in quite as much as they did elsewhere, and just using more drones. These kamikaze drones, these one-use drones, cost $500 plus a couple of $100 for a warhead, for ammunition, and they can do massive damage to tanks, to people on foot, and that was exactly the tactic we were looking at when we were with Ukrainian troops of the 47th Brigade in the east, in Avdiivka, or in and around Avdiivka last week. Let's have a look at how that works.
We're heading towards Avdiivka, a city Vladimir Putin has already spent more than 12,000 Russian soldiers' lives trying to take.
We've had intelligence that the Russians are planning to send in 250 infantry soldiers today to attack our positions. That's 250 soldiers attacking just our small section of the front here, which is basically 2 small bits of forest. We have to stop their attacks with kamikaze drones. If we send our infantry in to stop them, we'd lose a lot of people. As it is, we send in a piece of plastic carrying some ammunition, and we stop them in their tracks.
This is what counts for a trench round here. In a matter of days, they'll have to move on again, keenly aware they themselves are prime targets for Russia's drone pilots.
Look how many of them there are. Where are they going? Are they heading over there?
The Russians take advantage of the bad weather to attack. With fewer of our drones up in the air, we have trouble directing artillery fire against them.
At about $1,000 each, you can get 3 or 4 of these kamikaze drones for the price of a single artillery shell.
The signal's really bad. You've lost your connection. We lost the drone in exactly the same place.
Ukrainian team just behind me has just lost the drone, and they're trying to work out whether that was due to Russian electronic warfare or just simply the weather.
One day the signal's great and you can fly over long distances. The next day jamming will stop you from doing anything useful.
The Russians' electronic warfare systems can't be on 24/7. They don't have unlimited capacity. They switch them on when they're under attack, but they also have to switch them off again after a few hours.
Russian signal blocking technology is one thing. Other challenges are more fundamental. Humidity reduces signal quality, and cold is poison for batteries of all kinds. Often enough, pharmacy-bought heat packs are the only way to get the drones to even switch on. To push down prices, Ukrainian forces are increasingly building these drones out of wood or even chipboard. Good enough for a single-use weapon.
We need quantity over quality. The more drones we have, the more chances we get to hit our targets. It's scary for us to watch it all. The landscape is covered in bodies. The Russians advance over their own dead, and sometimes they even pretend to be dead. We find them anyway. I can't imagine what they're thinking. They must be very scared of their commanders.
In the space of a year, these improvised weapons have transformed the battlefield on both sides. They paralyze tanks, long thought key to winning battles, forcing them to stick to cover, unable to move without attack from above. It's this technological revolution that many believe got in the way of Ukraine's summer offensive, just as it's now slowing Russian progress here in Avdiivka. $1,000 drones taking out $1 million tanks has become the norm rather than the exception.
This war has proven that all the old ideas and strategies for fighting a war don't work anymore. The whole world is watching us, and they're realizing what still works. Look, one of them is lying on the ground, and there's another one underneath.
Giving directions is far from straightforward. Covered in snow, with most buildings and even trees destroyed, there's little to go by. And because they're flying at different altitudes and with different optics, reconnaissance and kamikaze drone pilots see very different landscapes. Processing all that information still makes or breaks these missions. For all the tech, AI has still not replaced humans for this kind of navigation.
There's two of them lying on the left-hand side.
Slow down, don't rush.
No, that's not the target. What we need is those two. Look, they're over there.
We need one of you to take over.
It's a clear hit. Two Russian soldiers caught out in the open. Realizing the danger, they pretended to be dead, but it didn't help. The Ukrainian drone pilots here tell us they've flown over this landscape so many times, they navigate by the abandoned Russian corpses. Those two men have themselves now become new landmarks.
DW's Nick Connolly reporting now there over the harsh reality of that war. And now I want to bring in Ulrike Franke. She is a defense expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations, with a special focus on the impact of new technologies on warfare, such as drones and artificial intelligence. Ulrike, how do you think should Ukraine change its strategy to get the upper hand?
Honestly, I find it very difficult to give that kind of advice from, the armchair, so to speak. I think the Ukrainians so far have been very good at what they've been doing. No one would have expected them to stay and to be able to defend the territory for so long. They have shown an amazing amount of innovation, as we've seen now with the drones. The thing is, the drone war, as we have seen it in the report that you just showed, it doesn't seem particularly sustainable, since there are so many drones being used and lost every day. I mean, the numbers are difficult to come by, but we're definitely talking 10,000 of drones being lost over several months, and that can't be sustainable. So in a way, I would emphasize that it is important to focus on fighting enemy drones, and then B, trying to have systems that are more robust, and therefore you don't lose them immediately once you deploy them.
Would you say that the use of drones and artificial intelligence has influenced the course of this war, and in which way?
I would definitely say that, yeah. So I'm always wary to say that one system decides a war or even a battle. I mean, it can decide a battle, but definitely not a war. But drones and artificial intelligence, software-supported warfare has had a huge impact in Ukraine. So mass formation, just as an example, mass formation, where you have a lot of targets basically in one area, that's basically no longer possible because drones are everywhere and they can be found and then attacked and destroyed. Artificial intelligence has helped with targeting, allowing the Ukrainians, for example, also to use less shells, less artillery shells, of which they only have so many. And also to combine data and help with data analysis. So all of this is very important, and it has allowed the Ukrainians to hold on. But of course, also Russia is using these capabilities, first-person view drones in particular. They've definitely caught on regarding that, and that's why I was saying that the Ukrainians should also focus even more on combating drones, on anti-drone systems.
Now, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief has said last month that Russia's effective reconnaissance of Ukrainian troop units was partly responsible for the counteroffensive stalling. Is Russia winning the drone war?
It has improved its situation with drones dramatically. So when Russia went into this war, it had roughly 2,000 drones. I mean, that's an estimate, but roughly that number, which may sound like a lot to maybe Western ears at the beginning of the war, but really was not a lot at all because, as we were saying, we're losing 10,000 drones a month or so now. So Russia quickly realized into this war that it didn't have enough drone capability, started buying them from Iran most particularly, and also started to produce more drones itself. And then it very much learned from Ukraine, because Ukraine, the one thing that Ukraine did really, really well was using civilian drones and kind of changing civilian drones, modifying civilian drones. First, these kind of quadcopters that everybody knows, and now first-person view drones with these glasses. And Russia picked up on that and started to do the same thing. And by now, what we hear from Ukrainian soldiers is that indeed Russia is slowly starting to win the upper hand because it has so many of these systems and it's producing thousands and thousands, while Ukrainians sometimes struggle to get enough. So while it's difficult to say at this specific moment in time who has the upper hand, Russia has definitely caught on in the situation where Ukraine was much stronger on drones, a situation we had a few months ago. That's no longer the case.
Now, do you see any other new technologies that could break the stalemate?
No, I don't think it's going to be a specific technology. So what always happens is that a new capability comes onto the battlefield. It's not always a completely new technology, but say a new system, a new drone, a new type that can do something that another system couldn't, and one side gets the upper hand. And that can last for, a few days, a few weeks, ideally a few months, but then the other side develops a countermeasure. And we've seen this. I mean, you may remember at the beginning of the war, we talked a lot about the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone. We don't talk a lot about this anymore. At one point, we were talking about cardboard drones because, they had small radar signatures, were difficult to detect. That's no longer a storyline. And the reason for that is not that these systems, suddenly stopped working, but that countermeasures were being developed. And I think that's the same thing we're going to see with every new development in Ukraine. That being said, yes, of course, artificial intelligence can really help to make things faster, more efficient, and can give you an edge. And sometimes, a little edge is all you need in a decisive battle. But I wouldn't say, this is the one technology, the one capability that Ukraine needs and Ukraine can get, and therefore it's gonna win the war. Unfortunately, war is more complex than that.
Ulrike Franke there, defense expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.